There's usually a little bit of a delay on that.
Yeah, there should be.
Well, I don't know, we haven't seen them yet, so all I know is what we wrote, and we haven't voted something, I think.
Should I refresh it?
Why not? Oh. We're live now, so don't. Just trying to see the chat.
But there are some additional bits about transition.
Yeah. Just want to make sure.
Right, shall we go down?
Yeah.
She's gone down.
Okay, cool.
But
So I'm guessing. Yeah, just say. Let's start it 1 minute's time. So watching them. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to London Metropolitan Archives and this event live from the archive. My name is Tom Ferber. I'm an engagement learning officer here at the archives, and this is part of a series of events in which we look at particular items from our current exhibition. So the present exhibition is London Portrait of a City, and it's running till the 6th of April, so just a few weeks left if you do want to come and see it in person. So London Portrait of a City looks at the various ways that that London has been depicted in sort of images, broadly defined throughout its history, looking at both the images themselves, the views, the changing landscape and the like, but also we're looking at the different crafts and techniques, the different methods that are used to create those images. Both things that you would think of quite readily come to mind, photograph, film, painting, but also various printing techniques and even wax seals as well. So we try and cover that that variety of formats, and as well as giving you kind of a nice rich look at London's history, we also hope that it will show off the various types of things that we have in the archive. We're very lucky at London Metropolitan Archives to have a breadth of different types of formats and things away from what you might perhaps traditionally think of that lives in an archive. So this will be the last of the Live from the Archive series focusing on this exhibition, and I think we're ending this series in quite a fitting place. So we started with one of the most sort of famous views of 17th century London, which you might just be able to make out behind me. This is the long view of London, or the Holler panorama by Wenceslas Holler. An overused word, but literally an iconic view of London, often used to depict 17th century London. And today we're going to sort of round off this series by looking at not so much the magazine, or the periodical I should say, but the technique that was used to create a series of very striking and easy to remember images of Victorian London, of 19th century London. So the technique that we're going to be looking at is the wood engraving technique, and we're going to be, as our kind of way into this technique, we're going to be looking at the work of Dore and his book A London Pilgrimage. So we're looking at wood engraving. So what's that? So wood engraving, as the name suggests, is the medium in which the image is created is wood. And although we have, slightly confusingly, we have wood cut, wood block printing as an earlier form, the wood engraving technique is a technique that's really devised at the final years of the 1700s, very early 1800s, and then becomes a very useful format for the 19th century. So what is this format and why is it so useful? So it's a printing format, that's the first thing to say. So it's a format where an image is transferred onto a matrix, is the technical term, and then that matrix can be used to replicate an image, and in this case actually hundreds of thousands of times, but certainly multiple copies can be made of the same image. And of course we could distinguish that from a drawing or a watercolour or a painting where you're dealing with unique images, or a very laborious process to create replica images. So it's a printing process, and in contrast to the other printing processes that we've looked at in this part of the series, this is what we call this, which were the intaglio printing presses, where the image is scoured into the printing medium. This is a relief printing press. So the best way to think of it is if you're like me and you printed things with potatoes on pieces of paper as a child, you cut away the bits of the image that you don't want. That's how you transfer the image onto your paper, and it's paper that we're working with today as well. So it's a relief printing process, and as the name suggests, it's a wood printing process. So how is this wood printing process different from the previous wood printing processes that were really fell by the wayside in favour of engraving processes? Well, it's all to do with the type of wood that you use, or more particularly the bit of wood that you use. It might say something about my age, but I'm getting increasingly into wood in recent years, and I understand that there's different bits of wood to use, different parts of wood do very different things. So before I digress too far into types of wood, the previous wood printing used the plank side of the wood. If you imagine your tree in the forest, obviously standing nice and upright, the tree is felled and it's split into planks. Well, that sort of the height of the tree would give you a plank, and the previous matrix in wood printing techniques used that plank. And then the arrangement of the fibres in the wood mean that's actually a fairly soft medium, which means it's easy to work with, but the image degrades and falls apart quite quickly. However, if you take our tree and you imagine that you take the cross-section, the bit that you'd have gone through where the trunk would have been, the part where the rings would have formed, that's called the end grain of the wood. The end grain of the wood, the fibres are aligned sort of, if you imagine like they're aligned differently, so you could see all the different points of it like that. And that means that's a much tougher material. So you can cut your image into that, and then that piece of wood will be good for literally, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of copies. So we now have the potential for mass production because the matrix isn't going to degrade. But if that wasn't good enough, there's another advantage. There's another advantage to using wood engraving, which is because it's a relief printing process. You can use the wood blocks alongside the movable type that would have featured in the printing presses, and that means that you don't have to have separate image inserts using different printing processes in your book illustration. So now, I'm sure you're probably one step ahead of me. We've set the scene for something like, well, an illustrated newspaper, because we can have image and text side by side. And this is why this kind of ability to set images by text and this ability to mass produce means it is such an important medium for depicting 19th century London. So as I said, it's probably most famous, the wood engraving techniques were most famous in the Illustrated London News, which is, we have an example of here. But me ever being the contrarian, I want to show you a little bit about the image that we have in the middle here. So this is Gustave Dore and Gerard Blanchard's London, a Pilgrimage, Shadows and Sunlight in London. And this is part of a kind of a burgeoning literature we have in 19th century London of a city trying to understand itself. I'm not going to the risk of anthropomorphising the city. London has grown hugely throughout the 19th century. We talk of sprawling growth, we talk of industrialisation, and it's a city that is actually quite foreign to lots of people that live there. They've emigrated from across the country, and indeed the world, and also it's simply growing and changing so quickly. So there's this real desire to understand London, and with a particular emphasis to understand really it's sort of social classes. So there's a huge kind of class anxiety in Victorian London. People are very concerned about their social status, how they fit in this class hierarchy, and they're also frankly concerned about what the people below them in that class hierarchy are going to do to them if things get out of control. So we see really starting with Henry Mayhew in around the 1840s, and then later on as well, you can also think of the work of Dickens, this desire to understand the contrast and the new kind of social status of the new London. And Gustave Dore's book falls very firmly in this category. And I'm always a bit careful with historical comparisons because they can feel a bit anachronistic, but then at the same time, of course, they help us understand things. So Gustave Dore was a well-known illustrator of his time. We can think of him something like a famous film director, and then when it was known that he was going to come to London and illustrate London, there was a degree of excitement about this. It's sort of the people of London, if you like, were waiting for their city to get the same treatment that other sort of literary subjects had, and other parts of the world, and Paris and other parts of France had by Dore as well. So there was great excitement when it came to this book. And in terms of the output, the book didn't disappoint. So we have 180 separate wood engraved images that illustrate London pilgrimage. I mentioned that wood engraving can be used to insert an image within the text very, very successfully, and we see that. But also we see in this volume as well that I have in front of me, we see both inlaid images and whole pages of engravings as well, actually bound on separate paper, and slightly confusingly, we're trying to navigate it with a separate numbering system as well. And this was this document, I should say, is part of our library collection here at London Metropolitan Archives, and we're now going to take a look at some of the detailed images as well. So Claire, could we have scene 1, I believe it is? So it might take a moment to load. Great, jolly good. So this gives you a really nice sense of the work that Dore produced. So this is this image was set accompanying text, and the idea was that the text and the image would follow quite closely together. But in practice, we do get a sense that Dore and Blanchard were working sort of slightly separate agendas. It doesn't always tie in quite as much as we might like. So the image that we can see gives you a sense of both what this work is famous for, and it gives you a sense of the types of image it creates. So it's grayscale. It's a black and white image. The image is made up with as relief printing as well, and I'm sure you can get a sense there how different levels of ink have come onto the image, allowing for the build-up of white and dark space. And this idea of sort of shadows and sunlight, of contrast, is, I think, both reflected in the content of the book and the medium as well. I think it's one of those nice marriages between the subject and the expression as well. So this. To hone in a bit more on the image, this is a warehouse along the riverside. We can see the various barrels that are being loaded up on the hooks, and we get this really nice view, I think, sense of the darkness of the warehouse, the kind of the hard work going in the warehouse, and that brightened out view across the river. And I think we can see a dome there, so I'm assuming we're on the south side looking across to St. Paul's. And it's worth remembering that we now today think of the very centre of London as for offices, and even really for sort of tourism and leisure. But back in Victorian times, that was the beating industrial heart of the city. That's where goods were coming in. That's where the fortune of London was being made, with goods coming from around the world into that point. So it's quite. Okay, so just been alerted that we're having a slight technical issue. The image isn't appearing. So just give me one moment. I'll see if I can fix that for you. So bear with me. My apologies for that. So hopefully we can all see the image now. If you can't, just let us know in the chat, and we will of course remedy that for you. Jolly good, jolly good. So I think we can. So I'll assume we can see it okay, unless I'm given the thumbs down, which is much worse than thumbs up. Good, jolly good. 2 thumbs up, so we can see it. Okay, so we're back to the image. So I'll just recap that for you. So we can see the image. Things to stress, I think, are how this theme of London a pilgrimage, contrast between wealth and prosperity, shadows and sunlight, is both kind of the topic of the book, but it's something that's really nicely extended into the medium used. This is a kind of a grayscale medium, and we can see these variations in tone and colour, which allow us to take that theme forward. We see a nice example in the image on the screen of how Dore also kind of contrasts, if you like, really the hard work and the labour and even the claustrophobia of some of his scenes with kind of bright, open, white space as well. We can't turn the pages, obviously, a limitation of this format, but if we were to turn the pages on this, we'd see the parts of London that are more prosperous, Hyde Park, the boat races, they would be a lot more white space involved in them than we see in these images there. And that sense of kind of real kind of darkness and kind of claustrophobia is going to be nicely illustrated in our next image as well. So Claire, if I could ask for scene 2, please. So what we're going to see here is one of the examples I said of the full page illustrations not set into the text. And this is just entitled A Busy London Thoroughfare. So hopefully on your screen now or in a moment's time, you will be seeing a busy London thoroughfare. And here we get a sense of the hustle and bustle and indeed the claustrophobia of the new contemporary London that was being built, really built around the Victorians as they were going about their business. This is definitely one of those ones that really rewards a kind of a close and studied look. And there's various places, I should say, where you can see these images online. Victorian Web in particular is a good source, but there's available at the British Library, some on our website, London Picture Archive as well. So, as I say, probably want to come back and have a look at yourself at some point, but there's a few things I want to point out before we close and take some questions. The first is just how peopled and populous this is. So that was something Dore was famous for. He previously illustrated Paradise Lost, and comparisons were made between the denizens of hell and the people of London. Have a look again at this use of tone, a very kind of dark image with kind of quite a dark centre, but with highlighted accents as well on the cart and the like. My favourite piece is probably just sort of bottom third, the figure holding out his hand. This sort of looks like a policeman or certainly some form of uniformed official. This sense of order barely being kept. This kind of tension between the hustle and bustle and the officialdom. So I mentioned that people were excited and anticipating this work. So how was it received? And the honest answer is not that well. So although and there was not so much for its kind of artistic its artistic ability or artistic accomplishment, but really in the way that London was depicted. So respectable critics, as it were, thought that Dore spent far too much time on the seedier sides of London. They deliberately kind of portrayed London in a negative light when it exaggerated problems, or it spent time emphasising problems that were already being solved or in the process of being solved. And in doing so, they then tried to sort of pick apart Dore's process. So we know that Dore disliked sketching in public. So what he would do is he would visit a scene, and then he would go back and sort of sketch from memory, and then he would use to produce this. And this was sort of used as ammunition against him in the production of this work. But despite the kind of contemporary criticism, it has become one of the very important and sort of touchstone reference works that we have for this period of London's history, alongside Illustrated London News, alongside Mayhew, and then later on, the other work that's probably worth mentioning at the same time is Street Life London by Adolphe Smith and Thompson, where in a similar idea, text and images, but in that case it's photographs that have been used rather than wood engravings. So with my apologies for that slight technical fault, we're going to draw the main the sort of formal bit to a close. So please, if you have questions or comments, I'm very happy to take them now, and I'll do my very best to answer them. So I'll give you a moment just to pop them in the chat. Don't worry about rushing. I know it can be a pain having to type under pressure. So we'll give you a moment to get those in. And whilst you're doing that, I'll just say that just remind you this exhibition is finishing on the 6th of April. We'll then have a little bit of a few days to change over, and then from that second week in April we'll be moving on to our next exhibition, which is called Magnificent Maps of London, something that I'm very much looking forward to. where we will be displaying many of the magnificent maps of London that we hold in our collection, and this series will be running as part of that as well, including an event on what is one of my very favourite things we have in the collection here, which is the so-called Agus map, or the Civitas Londinium, one of the earliest maps of London. So do we have any questions, Claire? Jolly good. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. It's really one of my favourite things to talk about, these wood engravings and the illustrated news more generally. So thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you at a future event soon. Bye now. So I've just seen, and I'll just get back in front of the camera. Just seen there was a question. Did Dore specify exactly where these themes were? For the most part, yes. For most of them, they are referencing a particular part of London. But then some of them they're a bit more generic. So really, just by the luck of the sample, the two that we have here aren't sort of named by place, but there are plenty of examples of Billingsgate, for example, Hyde Park, Houndsditch are a few that come to mind. Thank you. Great question. So, are there any more questions? We'll just wait one more minute. Sounds like there might be a bit of delay on the questions coming through, so we'll be here for another minute. Don't feel like you're going to get cut off. Okay, so thank you again, and if questions come up afterwards, you're very welcome to write in with them. The address is ask.lma@cityoflondon.gov.uk. Thank you again.